So thank you for joining us today for Tackling a Huge Website with WCAG EM. Our speaker today is Peter Shikli. Peter has over 30 years of experience in software development and project management. Peter is the CEO of Bizware, but now spends most of his time on the Access to Online program. Peter is actually joined today by a special guest speaker and subject matter expert. So we're delighted to also have Juliet with us today. Juliet is a certified trusted tester and also holds the IAAP Web Accessibility Specialist certification. And she specializes in automation and quality control processes. So she will be lending her expertise to Peter's presentation today. We are delighted to have Peter and Juliet with us to present today's webinar. Thank you for doing this, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Hi, I'm Peter Shikli. I'm with Access to Online, and I'm going to show you how to use the WCAG EM methodology to address the accessibility of a large archival website. I'm the CEO of Bizware of Access to Online. It's a private company operating within a state prison. We have inmates with over 2 years of accessibility experience who are, as mentioned, trusted testers certified by the Office of Accessibility Systems and Technology and the website accessibility specialists certified by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. So they helped produce this presentation, and one will be joining me, Juliet, to cover the technical details. The first third of this presentation will cover the program aspects from a project manager's perspective, but most of the presentation will cover the technical and implementation issues to follow. So, and that brings us to an ancient webmaster, Julius Caesar, who extols us to break processes into its components and then to divide and conquer. This is the fundamental idea behind WCAG EM methodology. And it is compartmentalizing. It's back at UCLA, for example, engineering problem solving often meant first breaking complex systems into simpler components for analysis. To use the online task management key to running Access to Online, we were constantly breaking big projects into little tasks. And when we got into the structured Section 508 compliance, that was broken into 81 specific failure conditions for testing. So let's talk a moment about an insight regarding how we usually arrange for the accessibility compliance of large existing websites the way Caesar would not recommend. We toss one big complex request for a proposal out there, what some call the whole enchilada, hoping for some heaven-sent vendor will figure it all out for us, wrap it up in a fixed price bow, and put all the confusion behind us. Let's see what really happens. First, the bidders ask how many pages in your website, so they can multiply that by maybe $50, maybe twice that, and then times however many thousands of pages you have. And because common standards such as WCAG leave open plenty of subjective calls, bidders may add a few bucks to protect themselves against this undefined scope. And there's always the change orders to cover any requirements left vague. But the worst part is if they actually succeed and produce a violation list encompassing most all of your website, as can easily be done via one of the automated website auditing tools. Where will you find the resources to remediate all of that? Resources you could use to make your future accessible instead. And if you don't do the massive remediation, you now have an official report following you around showing that you refused to remediate what the report listed. So, now we cover a better way to make a large website accessible by breaking it into at least two sensible parts, divide and conquer. If you've never heard of the WCAG EM standard, don't feel like the Lone Ranger. A great many experienced web designers have not. You can and should cure this immediately after this presentation. Rather than give you links to jot down, Google WCAG-EM. You will find a sensible methodology to select the few dozen pages that typically form what we call the representative sample of a website. And because WCAG-EM was written by the same thoughtful folks who brought us the WCAG standard used by the enforcement folks, it's the right approach to scoping your remediation project. With the pages to be remediated in hand, then you can apply the popular standards to each selected page to complete the process. Yes, this may require 2 RFPs, 2 requests for proposal, one to plan and scope, and another to audit and remediate. These are the 2 keys to the success of this whole endeavor. So purchasing folks will have an allergic reaction to 2 requests for proposal when one could do. Each RFP can take tens of thousands of dollars and months to process. The first point to make is that the scoping or planning RFP via WCAG-EM is often below the signature authority of the decision maker involved. That is, the amount the decision maker can purchase without getting permission. For the feds, that's $25,000 under the Federal Acquisition Regulation threshold. For states, that's typically $10,000, and this first planning work often costs significantly less than that. Keep in mind that the vendor chosen for this WCAG-EM scoping effort need not be the one selected to audit the scoped pages. But don't get slack because the dollars have shrunk. Insist on a fixed price bid, not time and materials, or a not to exceed. A vendor unable to produce a low fixed price bid may be hoping to learn WCAG-EM on your dime. And for the second audit RFP, don't settle for a violation list. Insist on clear remediation instructions matched to the workflow of your web designers. Even an automated accessibility tool can produce a potential violation list that will take you days, if not weeks, to wade through, only to find that most potential violations don't apply to your case. Or they point out, for example, that the link text needs to be meaningful, with you still left to define meaningful. So we're about a quarter of the way through the presentation, and this is where we take a short break to answer questions. But just about the WCAG-EM overview presented so far. The technical and implementation aspects of WCAG-EM are to follow. So let me encourage questions with one I hear often. What about just using our visitation log? First, WCAG-EM specifically forbids that approach, and here's a reason why. If you have a login page that accepts cookies, for example, then your visitation log won't tally the many times cookies are used to log in. Yet the disabled must pass that page at least once, or everything beyond is inaccessible. This is what I mean by the W3C folks looking at this from the perspective of your disabled visitor, and then developing WCAG-EM in response. I'm not here to rail against visitation reports. In fact, we produce a WCAG-EM report. We do look at visitation reports and simply add the popular pages to the representative sample that we recommend. So, open for questions.
We do have a few folks typing questions, but we do have one in the chat already from Robert, who asks, will you be sharing any example of WCAG-EM reports for real websites and web applications?
Affirmative. That's the 3/4 of the presentation coming up. No?
And then our next question is from Corb, who is looking for some clarification about what you meant about cookies on the login page.
Oh, okay. Let me clarify the first answer. We'll be going through the technical aspects of using WCAG-EM, but the final deliverable, the product that you get, is simply a list of the pages to audit. So the WCAG-EM report, go ahead, jump in.
Okay, so the report is actually fairly variable depending on what the evaluator and the person commissioning the evaluation have agreed upon. WCAG EM offers a lot of suggestions about what that could look like and what you might include, but we don't provide an example because there's so much variation. We do talk about the types of things that should be included in that, but we are not providing a physical example of a deliverable.
Now, to answer the question about cookies, when you log in, if you put in your username and password, besides the browser making a note of that, if the website uses cookies to determine my credentials, my username and password for logging in, then I can click the URL to go straight into my account, for example, and the server will read the cookies, grab the username and password, and I'll never pass through the login page, except that one time when I first log in, set my cookies, and then I go straight to, let's say, my account page. At that point, the visitation log will record the use of that login page as very small. A small number of people actually visit that page because the cookies prevents them from using it. But it is the door that the disabled must pass through at least once, and if it's not accessible, they'll never get the cookie. They'll never get into to all of the rest of the site.
All right, we had a comment from Robert who says, the process is very dense and difficult to follow. Without an example report, it is hard to know exactly how it would work in practice. Robert, I think it's probably best if we let them go through the technical explanation, and then if you have any other questions about the process, maybe at the next Q&A would be a great time to ask those. And then we did have one more question from Bridget, who asks, is defining key use cases something also suggested being in scope in addition to pages?
Okay, I'll take that one. WCAG EM does not require defining use cases, but is absolutely one of the things that you can agree to with the person commissioning the audit. Things like use cases, specific paths for functionality, all of that could be defined in the scope. And of course, with everything, it just needs to be clearly documented what the understanding is for that and then followed through. And then when the results are produced, you have to be really clear about how that happens so that it's replicable.
All right, I don't see any additional questions coming in. Just a reminder, we'll skip it for now, but for the next Q&A session, if you are connected over the phone, pound or hash button 6 to unmute your line. I will see that happen, and I will let you know when to ask your question. And we'll save that one for the next one. But those of you who are over the phone, that is an option for you. Peter and Juliet, I'll turn things back over to you.
Okay. So this will be my part of the presentation. I'm Juliet. So before using the WCAG EM, the accessibility specialist is assumed to have a solid understanding of several aspects of accessibility. Now, the first of these is the WCAG standard for individual web page analysis. When WCAG EM was published in 2014, the WCAG standard was WCAG 2.0. WCAG has recently published an updated version for individual page analysis, WCAG 2.1, but WCAG EM still references the previous 2.0 version. So step 4, which we'll get to, the page-level analysis portion of WCAG EM, requires the pages identified in the previous steps, which we will also cover, to be analyzed using WCAG 2.0. So this is an essential part of achieving accessible content. The WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 process is a subject worthy of significant discussion in and of itself, and as such is beyond the scope of this presentation. However, it has to be stressed that it is expected for the accessibility specialist carrying out WCAG EM to be proficient and understand WCAG 2.0. It's also important for the accessibility specialist carrying out this process to understand how different assistive technologies interact with user agents and how people with different disabilities use the web. This provides the knowledge base critical for understanding the broader context of web accessibility evaluation. WCAG EM does not require the use of any specific tool, browser, or testing environments. Often a combination of browsers and tools, both automated and manual, are useful in simulating the likely use patterns of people who will be accessing the content. Now, evaluation tools can absolutely increase efficiency, but they can't be relied upon to conduct most accessibility checks. The specialist carrying out the WCAG EM must be very familiar with both the limitations and advantages of a variety of evaluation tools and methods. When considering beginning the WCAG EM process, you may be wondering if it would be a good fit for your website. WCAG EM provides flexibility in how to determine the scope of applicability, which means that just about any variation of website is a good fit for WCAG EM. It's often the case that a website, such as a university site, may have several distinct areas. These areas may share pages that are common to all areas, such as legal notices, sitemaps, and general contact pages. When defining the scope of WCAG EM, the entire website or a single distinct area may be selected. In the example of a university, the website may contain distinct areas such as information for students, information for lecturers, courseware applications, and library applications. Any one of these distinct areas can be defined as the scope for analysis. Once the target website has been defined, it is vital that within the target website, all aspects of the website are considered for evaluation. Do not exclude any type of web page states, or functionality of the site. Failing to include a representative sample of any of these aspects is likely to distort the evaluation results and conflict with WCAG 2.0 conformance requirements. WCAG EM can be applied to a broad variety of website types. In the interest of time, we will only highlight a few of the possibilities. A website defined as the target of WCAG EM may combine several aspects of website types or be comprised almost entirely of one type of content. Web applications usually contain dynamically generated content and functionality. They're generally more complex and interactive, and they almost certainly use technologies other than HTML and CSS. The ability to generate a wide range of content and functionality sometimes makes it not feasible to exhaustively identify every web page state, and functionality of a web application. It is expected that web applications will usually require more time and effort to evaluate. If WCAG EM is carried out appropriately on a web application, the sample selected for evaluation is likely to be larger, reflecting the different types of content, functionality, and processes. As previously mentioned, websites sometimes have clearly separable areas. When one area does not require or depend on using another area of the site, as with an extranet for employee use, which is entirely separate from the public-facing pages, or when an organization has distinct subsites, they can be considered separable areas. Breaking apart a large website into separable areas allows for a single area or combination of areas to be defined as the scope of analysis. This flexibility empowers an organization to break large projects into manageable pieces and can also help keep track of remediation responsibilities. Now, for the purposes of WCAG EM, a website in multiple versions is one that has more than one version, and using one version does not require or depend on using another version of the website, such as when a website offers a mobile version or an alternate language version. Websites with multiple versions also usually have a different set of URLs, and each version can be considered an individual website for evaluation. When using WCAG EM to evaluate a website, websites using responsive design are not considered to be websites with multiple versions. Because responsive design websites only adjust the order, flow, and sometimes behavior of the content, they are considered web page states that need to be included through a later step in the process. The WCAG 2.0 method for evaluating individual pages also has portions which test for some responsive design aspects, and WCAG 2.1 addresses this even more thoroughly. WCAG EM is designed to be adaptable and addresses different aspects to be considered in particular evaluation situations and contexts. Again, for the sake of time, I'll only highlight a few here. Different approaches can be used for websites with separable areas depending on the organization's budget, time constraints, and other factors. Evaluating each website area separately can provide a more targeted baseline for future comparison. When WCAG EM is applied to individual separable areas, it should be followed by an overall evaluation, which includes a sample from each of the separable areas and any common web pages for the entire site. One of the benefits of approaching a composite website this way is that narrowing the scope of WCAG EM to a separable area, repeated across many separable areas, allows for a more complete coverage of the website in its entirety. This method can also provide insight about how the different website areas compare to each other and help determine which areas are most in need of limited time and resources. Now, aggregated websites are generated using content that is combined from different sources. These kinds of sites are usually significantly more challenging to evaluate because there are often many different content instances that can be generated. Because it's not usually possible to evaluate the content from their sources separately, content on aggregated websites can be evaluated as it is displayed to the users after it has been combined from the separate sources. Here at Access to Online, we frequently evaluate websites that utilize third-party content. This can present a unique challenge. Third-party content and apps may allow a site to offer many of their users useful dynamic content, but it's rarely accessible compliant. This is a challenge because third-party content is, by definition, not under the control of the website or web service providers. A comparable alternative to this content is often beyond the ability or budget of the organization to develop, provide, and maintain for their users. WCAG 2.0 recognizes how this can put developers and administrators in a tough position. You want to be accessible and compliant, but you also want to take advantage of the innovations provided by much third-party content. To address this quandary, WCAG gives guidance on how to achieve this result with a statement of partial compliance. Okay, so we're about two-thirds of the way through the presentation, and this is where we take a short break to answer more questions. But just about the scope of applicability presented so far, the evaluation considerations for WCAG EM are to follow.
All right, so we do have a few people typing. Just a reminder to those of you over the phone, pound or hash button 6 will unmute your line, and I'll give you a chance to ask your questions. And so go ahead and do that now. And our first question has come in from Joe. Can you post a sample statement of partial compliance?
We can absolutely do that, and we can reference the portion of WCAG 2.0 that talks about that. How would we do that afterwards?
Tell you what, can we, Kevin, can we simply send examples of the kinds of things that the audience is asking for to you after the presentation, and then you can distribute it to the audience? Things like a sample of that WCAG report that Mr. Fentress asked for, and a sample of this partial compliance.
Absolutely. So what we'll do in that situation, and this would also apply if we have some questions that we can't get to within the time limit, we will make sure that those get sent to Peter and Juliet after the session. They can send the answers back to me, and we'll post those questions and answers as well as any additional material on the handout page. You'll receive a follow-up email about 24 hours after this session is over. That follow-up email will contain a link to the recording, a link to the handout page, which will now have all the additional information, as well as a link to a feedback survey. So we can definitely add some additional content to this beyond the 90-minute scope of the webinar. All right,
Great.
and we have another question from Eliana. who asks, can you speak more about third-party compliance? Chat boxes and similar are of interest.
Sure. So let me discuss what we often find. So links to YouTube, embedded maps, document viewers, things of that sort are often imported through iframes and other mechanisms, and we find that they are very rarely actually compliant. And the person having us evaluate the website, of course, can't, well, they could, but it creates a lot of problems to patch the JavaScript or the other code being used to produce these. And so it's not really feasible for them to fix the content after it's imported into their website. What we here at Access to Online do is we produce a separate portion of the report that addresses that third-party content, and then the webmaster or evaluator of the commissioner of the audit can get a hold of the third-party content producer and provide that report. But then we also offer Peter here, who is happy to darken their door and say, hey, we got some stuff you might want to look at.
And in fact, that's something important to keep in mind. If you have somebody with credentials, whether they're certified in one thing or another, and they approach essentially the vendor to your customer and say, you're liable for the third-party app that you produced for us and for however many other people that you've done that for, would you like to be compliant? And to give them a path to that compliance, talking to the person who can perhaps smooth that process out for them, that sometimes is a lot more important for them. It becomes more of a priority. I mean, these third-party vendors would love to be compliant if they could. It's just a matter of the customer of the app coming back to them and saying, we're being audited, we're going through WCAG EM, we discovered that you're not compliant, will you take this opportunity to become compliant so that we and your other customers don't have to contemplate alternate apps, because we will eventually have to become compliant, with or without you.
Okay, and we've got one more question from Bridget. Can you give more detail on what the statement of partial compliance is? Who creates, provides, and at what point does a company get this?
Okay, so the statement of partial compliance is entirely the website organization's responsibility. Unless you're going through some kind of judicial complaint process, nobody really checks. So it really is up to the person posting the content to say, listen, we have evaluated everything on our site, and except for this piece, everything's compliant. So the statement of partial compliance has to include things like the scope of evaluation that was done, the date it was done, the level at which it complies, the pieces of content which don't comply, and that should be linked in an easy-to-locate place, often on the same page that the non-complying content is on. And it is up to the organization to keep that up to date and to make sure that the things that they say comply are still compliant in the future, and hopefully work with their third-party content provider to bring that content into compliance. WCAG 2.0 and WCAG EM both give pretty significant guidance on how and when to do this. There's a lot of details there, but that's the general thrust of it.
All right, it looks like David is still typing a question, so we'll give him a few more moments to finish that. We did have a comment from Eliana in regards to the answer for her question. She says, yes, thanks. Compliance and customer complaints are foremost in third-party vendors' minds. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat now. We should have plenty of time in this Q&A session, so keep them coming. And our question from David is, you mentioned that WCAG EM is based off of WCAG 2.0 and that you must be proficient in 2.0. Is there anything in WCAG EM page analysis that should be done to take into account WCAG 2.1?
Well, there are some fairly significant additions to WCAG 2.1 that I think overall are really important for accessibility. And when WCAG EM is updated to reflect 2.1, of course, those will be part of the mandatory process. But WCAG 2.0 doesn't address a lot of things having to do with mobile apps or even mobile displays. So when it is entirely acceptable for somebody who is doing a WCAG EM process to decide to use WCAG 2.1 instead of 2.0, but that also needs to be clearly delineated in the scope that you agree to with the evaluator if you're using an outside evaluator, or with the commissioner if you are the evaluator. WCAG 2.1 covers things like touch target size, motion actuation, contrast of non-text interactive elements. So those are all things that are really important in the big picture but aren't covered by 2.0. And if you're wanting to do a thorough job trying to be accessible as opposed to just compliant, because there is a little bit of difference there, then I would recommend using 2.1, but that's not what WCAG EM requires.
David says, thank you, that answered my question. We'll give everyone just a few more seconds. Those of you connected over the phone, pound or hash button 6, go ahead and do that now. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in. I'll turn things back over to you.
Okay. So in this part, we're going to talk about the scope of evaluation. Defining the scope of evaluation is a fundamental step, and it affects all the subsequent steps. WCAG EM is broken down into 5 discrete steps. However, it's not always an entirely linear process. Some of the evaluation processes can overlap, or they can be carried out in parallel. Additionally, as new information is revealed during the evaluation process, which it often is, evaluators may decide it's necessary to return to a previous step. The scope of the website can be a single separable area, a combination of separable areas, or the entire website presence of an organization like we discussed in the prior section. Defining a website for evaluation includes any aggregated or embedded content, as well as any content originated from third-party sources or different web addresses. Now, WCAG 2.0 allows for 3 levels of conformance. Level A, which is basic accessibility features, level AA, which addresses most common barriers for the disabled, and level AAA, which is the highest and most complex conformance target. Level A is generally the accepted and level AA is the generally accepted and recommended target for conformance. Now, this step, 1C, requires that the evaluator, in consultation with the evaluation commissioner, which is the person or organization requesting the evaluation, to determine the minimum set of combinations of technology which are expected to work with the features provided on the site. Because the variety of context possible across a website and the evolving nature of user agents, WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 do not predefine which combinations of features and technologies must be supported. The website owner and website developer may have a list of combinations that the website was designed to support, and this can be a really good starting point. But ideally, the evaluator should define a broad baseline to cover the majority of current user agents used by people, and this changes over time, of course. Different technologies to consider are web browsers, assistive technologies, and other user agents. Now, this baseline can be extended if content that was not identified in the early stages of the evaluation process is discovered. Any additional requirements desired by the evaluation commissioner need to be clarified and documented before the evaluation is started. The evaluation commissioner may want to include additional pages beyond what is needed for a representative sample, such as visitation log pages like Peter talked about, reports of all occurrences of issues rather than representative examples of the types of issues, analysis of particular use cases, as we discussed before, particular use situations, and user groups for interacting with the target website, or they might want adherence to specific documentations or reporting templates that are different than WCAG EM specifies, and so on. So before an evaluation begins, it's really important to develop internal processes for documenting the pages selected for evaluation. Here at Access to Online, we use an Access database with a really handy form which inserts the information into the database. After completing the selection process that we'll talk about pretty soon, we then convert the database into an Excel file that's provided to our clients, and that's probably what we'll post online for you guys. There are also several online tools that are provided for tracking the pages selected for evaluation. If you decide to develop an internal process for page entry and tracking, there are some categories of criteria that should be included, and these are selection criteria used for including the page in the sample, page title or a concise description of the page and the URL, content types present on the page, technologies used on the page, and additional notes. When cataloging pages, it's very important to use formalized identification of web addresses, as this helps to ensure common expectations about the scope of evaluation. Now, you also want to ensure that you'll have access to all relevant parts of the website. If you're a third-party evaluator doing this for somebody who is commissioning the evaluation, it may be necessary to create accounts or gain access to restricted areas of the website to complete the evaluation. This should all be worked out with the evaluation commissioner before the evaluation begins. You don't want to hit roadblocks halfway through. We found it helpful here to spend some time just exploring the site before actually recording any pages for potential inclusion in the sample. This allows the evaluator to get a sense of what kinds of content are repeated across many pages and which content is a unique occurrence. Becoming familiar with the website hierarchy is also exceedingly helpful for creating a consistent naming convention, especially when there's more than one evaluator selecting pages. So after documentation formats and naming conventions have been settled on, and an initial exploration of the website has occurred, then it's time to start looking for specific pages which meet the criteria that follows. And this is the real meat and potatoes of WCAG EM. The first step of this section is to identify and record all pages common to the target website. Common pages are typically linked directly from the home page, login page, and other entry pages, and they're often linked from the header, navigation, and footer sections of other web pages. Common pages can include the sitemap, contact page, site help, legal information, and similar web pages. They can also be web page states in web applications. Now, the next step, 2B, is to identify all essential functionality on the website. It's not necessary to identify all functionality of the website, just those functions which are essential to the purpose and goal of the website. For example, if you're a commerce site, selecting and purchasing products from the web shop, the vendor's method to sell products, completing and submitting a survey form, registering for an account on the website, and so on. After essential functions have been identified, locate pages that capture all different types of web pages and web page states. These should include examples of all types of styles, layout, and visual design, content such as forms, tables, lists, headings, multimedia, date pickers, lightboxes, sliders, and other controls, technologies such as HTML, CSS, JavaScript, ARIA, PDF, and others, varying templates, pages that change appearance and behavior depending on the user, device, browser, context, and settings, as well as dynamic content. Now, this is one area where it's really important to record in the notes section why this page was selected. Simply indicating that it was selected for being a web page type won't provide enough information to easily pick the smallest representative sample possible in the following steps. Specifically, early in this step, a page may be selected because it has a table, but later, a page that has both the table and scripted sorting function is found. How is the evaluator supposed to know which page is which? Making good notes about the content found on each page will quickly allow the evaluator to choose to include the web page which satisfies two content types, and this results in the smallest representative sample. The second to last step in this section is to identify a list of technologies that are relied upon according to WCAG 2.0. In this case, relied upon has a very specific definition. It means that the content would not conform if that technology is turned off or not supported. Such technologies may include web technologies such as HTML and CSS, auxiliary web technologies such as JavaScript and ARIA, specific web technologies such as SMIL, SVG, PDF, and so on. Many pages selected in this step may have also been selected in a previous step because they used that specific technology and they were the only example of it. Now, you should expect some overlap in page selection between the previous step, step 2C, and this step. The final step in this section is to identify pages that are relevant to people with disabilities. These pages may explain accessibility features on the website, provide information and help on the use of the website, explain settings, preferences, options, shortcuts, etc., or they may provide contact information, directions, and support instructions. So the outcome of this third step is to develop a list of pages to audit which are reflective of the accessibility performance of the entire website. The actual size of the sample of web pages and web page states needed depends on many factors, including the size, age, consistency, and complexity of the website, adherence to the development process in the website, etc. As a general rule, larger, older, more complex, or more dynamic sites have larger sample sizes. Now, the goal for most organizations is to end up with a representative sample which is as small as possible, thus decreasing expenditures for remediation. One of the most effective ways to do this is to select pages from step 2 that satisfies multiple criteria, as we discussed. Imagine a situation where a page has been included through step 2A as a common web page. This common web page also uses a date picker to perform a function, and common pages are mandatorily included in the final representative sample. WCAG EM only requires that one page utilizing the date picker be included in the representative sample, so the common web page also meets the criteria for step 2, content types, 2C, content types. There are a handful of other pages which use the date picker, and even though one of these has been flagged for possible inclusion in step 2C, only the common page needs to be included, and WCAG EM requirements for covering that content type have been met. However, a balance must be struck between a bare-bones approach and best practices. Imagine a similar case with a simple table on a common web page and a complex table that was found in step 2C. While WCAG EM requirements may technically be met by including only the common page with the simple table, best practice is to include the most complex occurrence of any given content type. This is most likely to capture the highest percentage of accessibility violations. Now, using the techniques we just discussed for selecting a small but fully representative sample, we get to the point where we then construct the structured sample. Now, the structured sample includes all pages identified in Step 2A, common web pages, Step 2E, other relevant pages, and Step 2B, essential function of the website. Those are all mandatorily included. So content from all the different types of web pages included in Step 2C and variety of page types, and content provided using all of the technologies identified in Step 2D, web technologies relied upon, are where you have the flexibility to really pick in a way that provides the smallest representative sample possible. Keep a lookout for pages that have the same URL but may have been entered under different page titles during different steps. The first several times that we did a WCAG EM, we had 2 or 3 evaluators picking pages, and our naming convention wasn't as formalized as we've come to use now, and we had a lot of overlap. So that was one of our learning experiences. It's really important to look for duplicate pages and to name things correctly. Make sure to remove any duplicate pages which have been inadvertently included. Randomly selecting a sample is required, and it helps to verify that the structured sample is sufficiently representative of the content provided on the website. WCAG EM requires a random sample that is 10% of the structured sample identified in Step 3A. For example, if the structured sample was 100 pages, then the random sample is an additional 10 web pages and/or web page states. There are many methods to randomly selecting a sample, such as using a tool that will traverse the website and propose a list of randomly selected web pages and web page states, using a script that will generate a list of all web pages and web page states available on a website to select from, and using server log, search engines, even blindfolded colleagues, and other creative methods to get a random sample. Now, whatever method you choose, the pages included in the step must be web pages and/or web page states that are not already included as part of the structured sample. And again, this is one of the situations where clearly recording the pages which are included in the representative sample as a result of the random selection is really important, because these pages are going to later be compared to the structured sample. Now, the last step in selecting a representative sample to audit is to locate any of the pages in the structured and random samples that are any part of a process. Locate the starting point for each process and include it in the representative sample. Identify and record at least the default sequence of web pages and web page states to complete the process. Now, for these purposes, the default sequence assumes no user errors and no selection of additional options. Make sure to record the branch sequences of the web page and web page states necessary to complete the process, and be clear in your records about specific actions needed to proceed from one page to the next in the sequence. Again, it has to be reproducible. So the WCAG conformance requirements are from the same organization which created WCAG EM. And for information on the auditing standards, refer to WCAG 2.0 standard and supporting documentation. For the purposes of WCAG 2 EM, repeated components such as the header, footer, navigation bars, search forms, etc. don't have to be audited each time they occur unless they appear or behave differently, or if it has been included as an additional evaluation requirement in Step 1D. A single instance of repeated components must be evaluated, and here at Access to Online, we find it most useful for the web developer responsible for the remediation if we clearly label the compliance issues found in these sections as originating from that section. This allows for the web developer to easily identify and remediate issues that may recur site-wide. First, except for pages which have been included in the representative sample because they're within or at the end of a complete process, conduct an accessibility audit at the previously determined compliance level using WCAG 2.0 conformance requirements. Now, this includes all components of the web page or web page states without activating any functions, entering any data, or otherwise initiating a process. Record the results using the method agreed upon when the scope was defined. Then, for any pages included in the representative sample as part of a process, follow the identified default and branch sequences of web pages and web page states, and then audit those results. It's only necessary to evaluate the portion of content that changes during the process. Functionality, entering data, notifications, and other interactions are all evaluated in this step. Finally, compare the audit results for the randomly selected sample and the structured sample. This is where record keeping is really important. The results should not show different types of content, accessibility outcomes, or findings. If this happens, it's an indication that the structured sample was not sufficiently representative of the content provided on the website. And in this case, evaluators need to go back to Step 3, selecting a representative sample, or maybe even back to Step 2, exploring the target website if you've missed large parts of functionality and content. Now, this final step, the report, pulls together the findings of the entire process. Thorough documentation, as emphasized so far through the previous steps, really helps streamline the final report, and it also helps to ensure verifiable outcomes. The amount of information included in the report will be dependent on the agreement between the evaluation commissioner and the evaluator. At a minimum, documenting the outcomes of each step is essential to the transparency of the evaluation process, replicability of the results, and justifications for any statements made based on this evaluation. WCAG EM does not require that the documentation is made public, but it does require specific documentation for all 4 prior steps. Refer to the specifications for details, and we'll be posting examples, and I'm sure we'll be happy to answer any further follow-up questions. Now, it's worth noting that depending on the desired granularity of the report documentation, The outcomes of the audit may be provided for each evaluated page or aggregated over the entire sample. At companies like Access to Online, we provide both in the form of reports for the individual pages and a comprehensive summary of the webmaster's accessibility remediations, which we call a SWAR, as well as documentation that outlines what pages were considered in each step, what we found on those pages, whether or not they were selected for inclusion in the representative sample, and why. Now, in the evaluation finding recommendations, WCAG EM suggests several additional optional kinds of documentation. Recording the evaluation specifics, such as archiving the pages audited and recording the evaluation tools, web browsers, assistive technology, or other methods used to audit the pages, can support conflict resolution in the case of disputes over the result of the evaluation. If thorough record-keeping and documentation practices have been maintained throughout the evaluation, recording the evaluation specifics should be a relatively simple information gathering process. Website owners may wish to make public statements about the outcome from WCAG EM evaluations. Such evaluation statements can be made when every non-optional requirement is satisfied, the conformance target defined in Step 1B is achieved on all web pages and web page states audited, and the website owner commits to ensuring the validity and maintaining the accuracy of the evaluation statement made. So statements of partial compliance can also be made where applicable, and we refer you to the WCAG EM and WCAG 2.0 specifications for details, and we will provide an example of that as well. An aggregated score can be provided to help communicate progress over time. However, aggregated scores can be really misleading, and they often don't provide sufficient context and information to really understand the accessibility of a website. If a score is provided, it's essential that the scoring approach is documented and made available to the evaluation commissioner along with the report. If a machine-readable report is provided, WCAG EM reminds the use of the evaluation report language, URL, which was specifically designed for this purpose, and see the URL specifications and WCAG 2.0 for more information about the use of metadata, including all machine-readable reports. And I'll turn it over to Peter now.
Okay. All right. So I guess the main takeaway is that the W3C folks have something important and carefully written to offer besides just WCAG. So I would suggest to get familiar with it. Try using it while this presentation is still fresh in your mind. There is no better, more logical way to address the accessibility of a large existing website from the perspective of the disabled. So include WCAG EM in your planning step before auditing and remediating. And then you can turn your resources to the future to make all content accessible and to educate content producers about accessibility. WCAG EM applies to just about every type of website, and the scope of it can be flexibly applied to meet the needs of your organization. With good record keeping and internal process management, WCAG EM can produce a manageable representative sample of web pages for auditing and remediation, making it a less daunting task to achieve an accessible website. So I guess we're going to turn this over for questions. There's our contact information. And indeed, we do like questions, comments, or ideas now, and that occur to you later as well. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Peter and Juliet. We have lots of questions in the chat already, but I do want to give our attendees connected over the phone a chance to ask some first. So please go ahead and unmute. That's pound or hash button 6 if you'd like to ask a question. I'll give you about 5 or 10 seconds to do that now. All right, I'm not seeing anybody going off of mute, so we'll jump into the chat. The first question is, in talking about the accessibility support baseline, can you give more examples of user agents aside from browsers and technologies like screen readers?
Sure. So the baseline things to consider are primarily browsers and screen readers, but here we use Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Chrome. We use NVDA, and then you might want to also include things like are PDF readers required? Do you have to have Flash to operate the website? Are you using puff and sip devices? You know, these are all things that might be specific to the person commissioning the evaluation because they know that their users use these specific things. By and large, though, it is just browser types and assistive technologies used. On our reports, we include in the header of every single page-level evaluation not only the browsers and assistive technology we used, but the suite of tools we used to test, just so that it's really reproducible, and if there's any questions, a client can come back and ask us about it. We can pull up the sheet. We can say, oh, this is what we used. This is how we got that. Let's show you.
All right, our next question comes from Robert. Are there enterprise accessibility testing tools that incorporate the WCAG EM process? For instance, tools that assist in the selection of the samples. I'm thinking something along the line of the WCAG EM report tool, but that saves progress to a database and includes tools for automated testing and that guides you in manual testing.
Well, that's pretty much all we found. We've done a lot of searching around, and honestly, we found the offerings to be a little sparse. And so that's where my process-oriented mind really took over, and that's why we chose to go with an Access database. One of the things we really like about that here is the nice form that you can create from an Access database, and the easy transferability of the data to many different formats. There's nothing that's going to hold your hand for this process, unfortunately. It is pretty complex, and you have to have a pretty good understanding of what they're talking about at each step. And then the more familiar you are with this process, the smaller representative sample you can select, and that really is the benefit of knowing WCAG EM. I don't think any tool provided is going to lead you to a small but thorough representative sample. That just comes from experience, and the tool can maybe record things nicely for you or indicate what information you should record, but all of that really just does come with experience.
If I could weigh in, if there's any of the accessibility tool vendors, then I would challenge you to take a look at where the automation steps in this are. We're partnered with an outfit like Moncito, for example. They do site-wide analysis looking for accessibility violations. There could be tools added to those kinds of enterprise suites that at least help with the recording issues that Juliet mentioned. And we have looked and have not seen it, and we wish that someone would produce those.
Yeah, I would like to clarify that there are a whole handful of tools that are used specific to the page level auditing, and those can go from a fairly big picture where you scan an entire website for page level problems, which you can then extrapolate potential WCAG EM criteria from, but nothing is going to beat actually looking at the page. One of the things to emphasize with WCAG EM is when you're picking out and evaluating content to decide whether or not a page represents one of the specific steps, you're not just looking at the tag structure. So, if you're looking for content types and you're looking for tables and you just use a scanning tool that finds all the table tags, you're going to miss a really incompliant table that's been maybe made with styling and not the tag. So those are the kinds of things that scanning tools just don't address. but are really important to include in WCAG EM. You know, the first step where you're selecting pages, you're not looking at whether or not the content conforms. You're not looking at whether or not it complies. You're looking at whether or not it's present. So is there a visual list? You know, the tags are secondary. So that's the kind of stuff that an automated scanning tool just isn't going to catch.
All right. The next question comes from Eliana. What tools can you use to generate a random sample?
Well, I can tell you what we do here. We use a sitemap, get numbers assigned to the pages, and then use a random number generator in a real simple Excel spreadsheet and correlate that to the page numbers and keep going until we find a sample of pages that we have not already selected.
That's very efficient. Robert has another question. How much time does it take to evaluate different types and sizes of sites, assuming, for instance, a 10% random sample? I know there's probably huge variability, but I'm just trying to get some sense of things.
Yeah, that question's really hard to answer. I hesitate because I'm just thinking of all the different kinds of sites we've seen. We've seen some, 3,000 page websites that it took 3 or 4 person days to conduct the first steps of the WCAG EM before the analysis level, page analysis level. And that was because the pages were really consistent. They used 3 or 4 kinds of templates. There wasn't a lot of variation in content. But then we've had sites where you can tell that they've been developed over the course of 10 or 12 years and they've never done a comprehensive update, and you can see the fingerprints of 5 different web developers who do things differently, and there's really widely inconsistent content, and that kind of stuff can take significantly longer. If you're looking at a 2,000-page website presence with a bunch of documents, maybe, and there's not a consistent process, you can spend several days just really getting familiar with the site and what's there and making sure you pick a good representative sample. It's worth it to spend the time on the front end making sure that you get a really, really solid structured sample, because if you compare your structured sample and your random sample and you find significant differences, you have to go back to step 1 and start all over. And so it's really better to be thorough in the beginning.
And then Robert also asks, do you use the Trusted Tester conformance test process for assessing individual pages? I know that isn't a requirement for WCAG EM, but I think you'd need some defined process for that for the replicability aspect of the report.
Well, we use a lot of the methods that we learned in Trusted Tester version 3, let me be clear. But those, as much as Trusted Tester is really useful and produces a replicable result, there isn't a lot of flexibility. And WCAG EM requires looking at things through the lens of WCAG, which has a pretty different feel than Trusted Tester. We have defined our own internal processes for every step. We often have 2 or 3 methods to find the same information. And each analyst may prefer a different method. Some people like digging straight into the code. Some people like using a tool, but the result is the same. And one of the things we can do for our clients is guide them through whatever we've used. That's why it's so important to record the browser and the methods used and who did it, and be really firm in your understanding, so that if someone comes back and says, hey, I don't understand how you got this, so let me give an example. We did a report and the person said, I don't see these iframes that you're saying don't have titles. And so we had to go back and walk them through, use this browser, do it this way, do you see them now? And they did, and it turned out it was some JavaScript file that had been used that only inserted them in a specific browser in a certain way. But I think Trusted Tester is useful for providing a general framework and getting a good understanding of tools. And the new version 5 refresh uses Andy, which cuts back on the necessary plugins and such, and is works with every browser because it's a handy little bookmarklet. But I think that is not thorough enough for the kind of analysis that we do here, at least.
All right, we have a couple of other questions to get to, but Robert had a follow-up question. He just asked, is that process published somewhere? And I'm assuming that process refers to the Trusted Tester version 3.
Oh yeah, Trusted Tester version 3 is published. Trusted Tester version 5 draft is published. But I think Robert was probably asking about our specific process, and no, it is not published.
Perfect.
We're happy to walk any client through any result that they question and replicate it for them, but we don't give away the store.
Looks like that was Robert's question. Yes. Okay. We'll move on to James, who commented, Robert, you might look at some of the enterprise solutions from DQ or Level Access. I don't know if they specifically use WCAG EM, but they do have testing tools based on the success criteria for WCAG 2.1. We had a few comments in support of Moncito. And then we had a question from Doug, who asks, does the WCAG EM process address how to identify/remediate reported issues past just the sampled pages or modules?
Well, the assumption with WCAG EM is that the organization is going to take the report from the representative's sample that you have audited and apply that to all of the pages in their website presence. I'll let Peter speak to how enforcement regards WCAG EM versus accessibility, but the WCAG EM preference from the W3C folks is that every page will eventually be remediated, which I understand sounds a little bit insane when you're talking about maybe a 10,000 page archival website presence.
Right.
So I think WCAG EM just says everything should be compliant, and use the results you found and apply that to every kind of content instance you find, even on the pages not specifically evaluated through this process. Hopefully with WCAG EM, though, you're hitting all the majority of pages that are not archival. You're hitting the majority of pages that people need to use to complete any kind of process, to get any kind of information, that kind of thing. So there's a good likelihood that you're at least, hitting the 80-20 rule.
And you see, one of the other things to keep in mind, this is just as an observer, when, let's say, we were contracted to help clients respond to judicial complaints. I'm by no means a lawyer, but I got to watch how the enforcement folks operate, and I would venture to say that they tend to be gentle in the understanding that they know that there's limited resources here, and that at some point, if they can help the defendant, if you will, switch from spending resources on fixing the past to ensuring that everything in the future is accessible, then that will actually benefit the community that they serve. So when I've seen accessibility plans formed, things that we put together, if you can present to them a WCAG EM solution to what you will do now for your website, and then turn your resources to making sure that everything is compliant in the future, then a lot of times that's actually put into the accessibility plan that they will authorize. Keep in mind that WCAG EM says nothing about the future. It says only, here's what we can do about your past. The enforcement folks make it clear that everything you produce from some moment forward will have to be accessible. There will be no partial compliance going forward, and they know that you work within the limited resources that you have. So switching over to that perspective of looking at accessibility as a process that you're going to do the best going forward, that's actually in line with their considerations. All they need is some ammunition from you about how realistic your plans are to make that past accessible within that partial compliance framework, and then you put that into the accessibility plan, and my experience is with that behind you, they tend to accept it.
We had a comment from Doug. It does get difficult when dealing with a large website when IT partners tend to only fix the instances that can be pointed out to them. And I did see we had a few more questions coming in, so please continue typing. One final reminder to those of you over the phone, pound or hash button 6 will take you off of mute, and I will give you a chance to ask questions verbally. So please go ahead and do that now if you do have questions. We'll give our last couple of folks a few minutes to continue typing here. Okay. Do you have any recommendations on how to develop your own process of testing or resources to look at to develop one, since you don't feel the TT process, trusted tester process, is robust enough for evaluations? Do you think the new trusted tester process being rolled out now will be more robust because of the refresh?
Okay, so I have taken a pretty comprehensive look at the Trusted Tester draft. That's all that we could find. And it does seem to be much more robust. One of the things I like about the new Trusted Tester process is that it uses the ANDI tool that I mentioned, ANDI tool, which is not browser specific. And it being the Trusted Tester version 5 process, the refresh, really has addressed much of WCAG 2.0, a little bit less of WCAG 2.1, and I think even if you were just to look at the Trusted Tester test process, you would need to understand a lot of the behind-the-scenes curriculum to be able to be really efficient. When developing our test processes, we looked at WebAIM, Trusted Tester, and the language of WCAG 2.0, and we just had to spend a lot of time digging into the specific failure conditions and the success criteria, figuring out where the differences were, what is a best practice versus a requirement. You know, we used those as starting points and then really had to go from there.
And you have to keep in mind the perspective of Trusted Tester was from the federal sector to try to make uniform, objective, and structured the process by which multi-million-dollar website apps will be evaluated for procurement, so that the report that one Trusted Tester produces looks a lot like what another one would produce, that people can count on these things when they're building these large websites to either pass or fail using criteria that, like I said, will be objective and structured. Now, they pivoted, as they call it, to the WCAG standard, which I think is great for the whole disability community because it unifies from what used to be the Section 508 standard into one standard. But they're still going to follow that highly structured objective methodology in the way that they go through their 81 different failure conditions. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from that, but it's not necessarily the way that everyone else should do it, because the WCAG standard is also good at producing its own structured objective test methods. And I think that in a sense they're kind of honing in on the same target, but they're coming from those two different directions.
All right, I do see one additional person typing a question, so we'll give them a moment to do that. I did post a link to the Andy tool. So that link is to the how to use page, which is the sort of main page of the website, and then there are some links to install and use that as well. So feel free to take a look at that. We'll give everyone
Thanks, Kevin.
just a few more moments to continue typing in. Yes, absolutely. While they're here we go. So Boutros, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says there is also SiteImprove automated tool for a complete website accessibility evaluation, but as any automated scanning tool, it only catches about 72% of the success criteria of WCAG 2.0. Manual inspection is needed to supplement the shortcomings. This is my experience. All right, thank you. I don't see any more questions coming in at this point, so I think we will call it an end. Thank you so much to Peter and Juliet. This was an extremely informative presentation. I can't thank you guys enough for.
If I may add,
go ahead. Absolutely.
I completely agree with Boutros.
I would also agree. We use a similar site-wide scanning tool. It's not SiteImprove, but I would say 72% is generous. What we do mostly is we will conduct our own thorough testing process, pull up our automated scanning tool, and just check to make sure that there's nothing there that we missed. And I'd say almost exclusively, there is maybe a third of what we find on the automated tool. And it's things like, not having an explicit label or a contrast issue. It just simply can't test things like tab order or sensory characteristics or even really keyboard accessibility.
Or how does it produce an alt attribute in the simplest of cases, or define that it's a decorative image? So I agree.
All right, thanks guys for that extra info. We do have a couple of additional people typing, so I will let them continue. But in the interest of time, I am just going to run through a few kind of closing announcements as the last couple of folks are typing. So again, thank you so much to Peter and Juliet. This was a great presentation, and thank you to our captioner as well. Great service for this session. I am going to switch over to a different slide here. So as always, we have a feedback survey. We would love to hear what you thought about this session, and if you have attended any of our previous webinars, or specifically last month's webinar for building the business case for accessibility with Claudio Vera, please go ahead and fill that out. You can select the link right here in the slide, or we will send that link to you as well in the follow-up email going out 24 to 48 hours after this session. We'd love to hear from you. It helps us to plan next year's session. Your feedback helps us determine the content that you guys want to have, so please take a few moments to do that. As I mentioned at the beginning, we also record all of our webinars. This webinar will be made available about the same time that the follow-up email goes out. We will add it to our webinar archive library. So if you have friends or colleagues who perhaps missed this session, it will always be available to them as an archive. And as live attendees, you will receive a copy of the archive as well, so you can review it at any time. Coming up, tentatively scheduled for March 28th. Keep an eye on your emails if you're planning to attend this one. We may have to reschedule it. We're going to have web accessibility techniques for React.js and AngularJS. That's with Chris Lane. It should be a great session, but like I said, just keep an eye on the announcements if you plan to attend that one. We will let everyone know if there does need to be a date change. Following that one, we will have social media accessibility, and that is going to be with Gian Wild. If you don't know Gian or what she does an annual audit of the biggest social media platforms. So Facebook, Twitter, the normal stuff. But this year, she has added Pinterest and Instagram to the list. So this will be a fresh version of her 2018 accessibility of social media platforms audit. So that should also be a great session. I also just want to let everyone know that we are still accepting applications to be part of the 2019 webinar series. So I am going to put a link in the chat, and we will also include this link in your follow-up email. If you or anyone you know is interested in presenting an IAAP webinar, we do have an interest form for you to fill out, and there is some more information about sort of what goes into producing an IAAP webinar on that form, so please feel free to take a look. Please submit any webinar ideas you have, and we would be happy to review those. In particular, for this year, we would still really love to have a webinar on EPUB, as well as artificial intelligence or anything related to IoT, the Internet of Things. So please consider that as well. Without further ado, I think that does conclude our webinar. Thank you everyone for attending, and again, a huge thanks to Peter and Juliet. To close the webinar today, you don't have to do anything special. If you're connected over the phone, simply hang up, and if you're in Adobe Connect, you can just select the X at the top. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next time.
I guess at this point.